Good morning, Pinecrest. Please stand for the reading of God's Word. Today's reading is from Romans 7, chapters 1 through 13. Now, dear brothers and sisters, you who are familiar with the law, don't you know that the law applies only while a person is living? For example, when a woman marries, the law binds her to her husband as long as he is alive. But if he dies, the laws of marriage no longer apply to her. So while her husband is alive, she would be committing adultery if she married another man. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law and does not commit adultery when she remarries. So, my dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ. And now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. When we were controlled by our old nature, sinful desires were at work within us, and the law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds, resulting in death. But we now have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its power. Now we can serve God not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit. Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would never have known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, "You must not covet." But sin used this command to arouse all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there were no law, sin would not have that power. At one time, I lived without understanding the law. But when I learned the command not to covet, for instance, the power of sin came to life, and I died. So I discovered that the law's commands, which were supposed to bring life, brought spiritual death instead. Sin took advantage of those commands and deceived me. It used the commands to kill me. But still, the law itself is holy, and its commands are holy and right and good. But how can that be? Did the law, which is good, cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. So we can see how terrible sin really is. It uses God's good commands for its own evil purposes. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, man. Oh, good morning, good morning. If we have not met, my name is Pastor Jake, and I am so glad that you are with us this morning. And here's the question I want to ask you to start. Who here loves a good love story? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you would say you're something a little bit of a romantic. Jack and Rose, Romeo and Juliet, Pastor David and the Broncos. Well, this morning, I wanted to read you a love story that I heard a pastor named Dr. York use on this text. So this is the story. Kim was once married to a man named Tim. And Tim was an incredible, magnificent man. He was always well-dressed. He wore the Brooks Brothers suits. He was solid and dependable. He had a great job. But he never showed affection to Kim. He cared more about what she did than who she was. He never smiled at her, never seemed to delight in her. And if she ever did anything to displease him, he would let her know and correct her. He always had comments about how she dressed, how she spent her time and money. And nothing she did was ever good enough for him. Needless to say, they had a very difficult marriage. Well, one day, they were in this terrible car accident, and Kim's joyless husband, Tim, died in the accident. And one of the first responders who was there, who pulled Kim from the wreckage, who risked his life to save Kim, well, his name was Jim. See, of course, Kim was upset and frightened, but Jim talked very kindly to her. He calmed her spirits. Kim ended up in the hospital, but Jim would come and check in on her. Jim would come and bring her flowers. Jim would sit and talk with her for hours and hours. And eventually, when Kim was discharged, Jim took her home. And once Jim took Kim home, he noticed that her lawn was uncared for, so he mowed her lawn. He noticed that her home needed some repairs, so he fixed up her home. And needless to say, Jim wooed Kim. And the day came where Jim asked Kim to marry him, and she gladly said yes. And comparing her life now with Jim versus when she was married to Tim, she could not believe her fortune. When Kim would not clean the house right, Jim never critiqued her. He would help her. Jim would brag about Kim to his friends. Kim would long to be with Jim every time Jim was gone. She was so in love with Jim and thought the world of him. Yet, still from time to time, she would think back to her marriage with Tim and miss it. She could still hear Tim's voice in her head. So sometimes she would try to still do things to Tim's standard of perfection. But she knew she was never good enough. Kim could think back to Tim pointing out all of her flaws. Yet Jim would encourage her and love Kim just the way she was. For some reason, sometimes Kim wished to be ordered about Tim used to. Now, let me ask you something. Does that make any sense to you? That she is so wonderfully loved by Jim, yet she misses the marriage where she was never good enough. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make any sense, but it's very typical. Very, very typical. See, this is what Paul is talking about this morning. See, Paul uses this illustration of a marriage. Why would Kim long to go back to the first marriage when it was so hard to be with someone she could never please? And friends, that is what we are talking about this morning. As Christians, we are constantly tempted to live under the law. Or better yet, we're tempted to make up new laws and create legalism. How many of you would say you grew up in a legalistic household tradition? Raise your hand. Legalistic background. Okay, so fair bit of us. I'm always fascinated when David tells me stories about growing up as a Nazarene. And if you don't know, Nazarenes, whoa. Nazarenes, they weren't allowed to drink root beer. Heaven forbid you drink a real beer. They weren't allowed to go to the movie theaters because someone could see you in the movies and you didn't know which movie you went and saw. Stuff like that. It's so crazy to me. You know what? Nazarenes almost have Mormon-level rules. Have you ever met a Mormon and you've been wondering if they've been drinking coffee? You know what I mean? Because they're like, Mormons are always nicer than normal humans, but then you meet a Mormon who's just a little bit too nice and you've been wondering if they've been drinking coffee. See, Nazarenes almost have rules like that. And I wonder about you and your background. How many of you would say that your background or you connect to some part of the movie Footloose? Raise your hand. How many of you even like the movie Footloose? Oh my gosh. What a terrible movie. I just want to dance. Like, what? Have you ever met anybody like that? No. Yo, there's not a teenage boy in the world like that, okay? Yeah, well, I remember when my parents showed me that movie and I was like, okay, really? Interesting choice. I bring this all up to show us, for whatever reason, we long to return to the law. Why? It's just like Kim longing to return to Tim. It doesn't make any sense, but it's very typical. And this is the message for us this morning. We are not bound to the law. We are bound to Christ. We are not bound to the law. We are bound to Christ. See, Paul is going to teach us a very valuable lesson this morning. As Christians, we are not bound to the law of the Old Testament and no longer need to live as if we live under the Old Covenant, but instead we are bound to Christ. But what does that mean? And what does that look like? And that is what Paul's going to show us this morning. So our first point is the law's relationship to believers. And let's look at verse 1. Now, dear brothers and sisters, you who are familiar with the law, don't you know that the law applies only while a person is living? Okay, so let's stop right there. So when he says the law, what is he talking about? And I think what he's likely talking about is the law of Moses, the entirety of the law of Moses. And if you don't know, The entirety of the law of Moses was 613 laws for the people of Israel to follow. 613 laws. And the main idea he's going to set up here is he's going to be contrasting the Old Covenant and the Old Testament and the New Covenant and the New Testament and how we are to live under the Spirit in the New Covenant. Okay, the next question we have from verse 1, if you look, he says, you who are familiar with the law. Well, who's he talking to? Jews. Good job. Really good job. And if you don't remember, the Roman church was made up of both Jews and Gentiles. But the Jews had been expelled from Rome for 5 years, and so the Gentiles were in charge. They were leading things. Eventually, the Jews were allowed to come back, and they see that the Gentiles had been leading the church. They've been eating bacon in service. They changed the carpet, and there was a lot of tension. All right, in the last part here, he says, don't you know the law applies only while a person is living? Isn't that weird? Like, yeah, of course. Of course, the law only applies and only has authority over somebody during their lifetime. Okay, look at verse 2. For example, when a woman marries, the law binds her to her husband as long as he is alive. But if he dies, the law of marriage no longer applied to her. In verse 3, so while her husband is alive, she would be committing adultery if she married another man. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law and does not commit adultery when she remarries. All right, so Paul is using the illustration of marriage to make his point. And in Paul's example, we are the bride. And I think he does that on purpose, and he's really intentional with that. See, in Jewish law, the bride could never divorce her husband, no matter what. She was totally, completely stuck to her husband. And kind of what Paul is saying is you were totally and completely stuck to the law. But then you died, releasing you from the law. And we understand this because in our wedding vows, we say, to death do us part. We understand that. Death ends a marriage. And Paul's saying we died. How many of you guys like 1990s, 2000 country music? Raise your hand. Like, that's your jam, right? Not the new stuff, the older stuff, right? How many of you remember when the Dixie Chicks were still the Dixie Chicks? You know what I'm saying? The Dixie Chicks have a song called Goodbye, Earl. Do you remember it? Mary Ann and Wanda were the best of friends. You remember? All right, here's what the song's about for all of you who are totally lost right now. The song is about two women conspiring to kill one of their husbands. Why? Earl had to die. That's the point. Earl had to die. And what does Earl's death do? Frees her from the marriage. Frees her from the marriage. You know, I heard a funny story once that Billy Graham's wife, Ruth, once was asked, have you ever thought about divorcing your husband? And Ruth said, no. Never once have I thought about divorcing my husband. But I have thought about murdering him. It was a real marriage, I guess. So Paul is saying we have died, releasing us from our marriage to the law. That's very important. And this brings us to our next point this morning, the purpose and limitations of the law. Look at verse 4. So my dear brothers and sisters, this is a point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ. And now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, you can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. See, believers have died in Christ, our old selves are dead, and we now have new life because of the resurrection of the Son, right? Why I just got baptized. That's what it's all about. Maybe you remember a couple weeks ago we were in Romans 6, and Paul is talking about baptism because you die and are resurrected. That's what he's talking about. So he's saying if you are united and bound with Christ, you died to the law. You are no longer bound to the law. And this is also why I think Paul is so careful saying that we are the bride, because we are now the bride of Christ, bound to Christ, just like a husband is bound to his wife, right? And look at this. This is what Paul says in Ephesians 5. For husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her, right? This is the idea that the church is the bride of Christ. The church is now bound to Christ. All right, verse 5. When we were controlled by our old nature, sinful desires were at work within us, and the law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds resulting in death. What an interesting verse. Look at that word aroused. The word aroused in Greek is the word aphromene, and it's often used, it literally translates to gives energy to. That's the literal translation. But how it's used very often is to describe setting up a base camp. Setting up a base camp for a military operation. Setting up a base camp, if you were going to climb Everest, you have a base camp before you scale, right? Or how cool is it that Mike showed us Armenia, a green dot in the middle of red. Armenia is a base camp for Triad. Okay, so this is kind of what Paul's saying. Think about it this way. He's saying, sin is so bad and so evil, it sets up a base camp upon the law to attack you. Okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? What it looks like is as soon as you hear to do something, as soon as you're told to do something, you want to do the exact opposite. You don't want to be told what to do. You want control. You don't want somebody else to have control. So this is what it looks like, is you want to rebel. It's a sovereignty issue. If you're anything like me, as soon as someone tells you to do something, you want to do the exact opposite. Because sin is so bad, it sets up a base camp upon the law to attack us. Do you guys remember a couple years ago when Governor Polis had Meat Out Day? Do you remember this? We weren't supposed to eat meat for one day. This was a couple years ago. You remember? Let me ask you something. What did you eat for dinner that night? I had a ribeye, personally. Why? What does this demonstrate? As soon as I'm told to do something, I want to rebel. I want to do the exact opposite. And that is what Paul is saying, is that when we hear the law, we want to disobey it. Look at verse 6. But now we have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its powers. Now we serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit. We are no longer bound to the law, we are bound to Christ. Friends, we obey God not because it's I have to do these things to have right standing with God. It's no longer I have to, it's I get to. Because I am in right standing with God and because of my relationship with God, I obey Him. I get to obey Him. I get to choose the things of life. We do not have to obey a written code of the law. Rather, we follow the spirit of the law. Now, I want to talk about something super important. Sometimes, skeptics of Christianity will look at Christians in the entirety of the law in the Old Testament and say, you guys pick and choose what laws you want to follow. And this is what it looks like. You decide you like bacon, so you eat bacon. And you decide that law doesn't matter anymore. You wanted to get tattoos, so you decide that law does not matter anymore. You like shellfish, so you decide that law doesn't matter anymore, and you pick and choose. And you want to know where the criticism usually comes? But you keep the oppressive laws about sexuality. That's usually what the skeptic's criticism looks like. You pick and choose, and then you leave the laws about sexuality to oppress people. Now let me ask you something. Do we pick and choose what laws we follow from the Old Testament? Is that what we do? I don't know how many Christians can articulate why is it that we can eat bacon now. So I want to talk about this. One of the most important things to remember when you are reading the Bible is that the Bible was written for you, but not to you. The Bible was written for you, but not to you. Okay, this letter for Romans was written for the Romans in the first century. Okay, it's not written to Parker, Colorado in 2023. We have to understand that. Now, it's written for us because this is the special revelation of God. Does this make sense? If you want to hear God talk, read your Bible. This is the special revelation of God. But we have to understand it. And so here's what I mean. Here's where I want this to sink in for you. How many times have you been trying to do your devos? You're going to do the Bible in a year like Wyatt was saying. And you start in Genesis, and you have your coffee, and you put it on Instagram to prove that you actually read your Bible. And you're going through Genesis, and there's a lot of weird stuff going on. But you can ignore all the weird stuff because there's a story to follow. And so you can keep going. And then you get to Exodus, and there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but you can ignore the weird stuff because there's a story. And then you get to Leviticus. And you have no idea what's going on. You are bored to tears reading about these laws. And you have no idea if they apply to you. You have no idea. So what's going on? Listen, Leviticus was written for Jews to follow. It provides their ceremonial and civil laws that they follow. So this is something very important I want to point out to us all this morning. In the Old Testament, there are 3 types of laws we see. 3 types of laws in the Old Testament. One of the laws we read about is ceremonial laws. Leviticus is full of ceremonial laws about how do you present a sacrifice, how do you present an offering, what do you do in the tabernacle. And all the dietary laws are ceremonial laws because the dietary laws have to do with a person's holiness and cleanliness, okay? Ceremonial laws no longer apply to us as Christians because Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. He completely fulfilled all ceremonial laws. So, you can eat bacon now. Number 2, the Old Testament has civil laws. And the civil laws in the Old Testament were for the nation of Israel. Sometimes we forget that Israel was a literal country with literal laws that they needed to follow. And so we are part of a new Israel or a spiritual Israel, but I don't know about you, but I'm an American. So I follow America's laws, right? So we don't have to follow the civil laws. And instead, Israel always had these kings, right? Had these judges or kings ruling. We no longer follow a king, we follow the king. Does this make sense? All right, the last type of law we can see in the Old Testament is the moral law. And these are laws that deal with God's nature. Think about it this way. So in the Old Testament, God says, have no other gods before me. You think he's okay with you having another God in the New Testament? No, of course not, because that has to deal with his character. That has to deal with who he is, and he's unchanging. So the moral laws in the Old Testament have to deal with the character of God. And if God is unchanging, then these moral laws are unchanging. And I want to point out a couple things to you. That in the in the New Testament rather, these moral laws are restated and they're intensified. But look at this real quick. There was a British theologian named J.I. Packer, and he said this. He said, the Christian is free from the law as a supposed system of salvation, but is under Christ's law as a rule of life. And so he's quoting here Galatians 6:2, share each other's burdens, and in this way, we obey the law of Christ. Friends, we live under the law of Christ. We live under the Spirit of Christ. And the law of Christ holds the moral law because it has to deal with the character of Christ. And like I said, the moral law is reaffirmed in the New Testament, and the moral law is intensified in the New Testament. See, we are bound to Christ in the spirit of the law, but Jesus raises the bar. He makes things harder. And so that brings us to our last point. The law's role in revealing sin. All right, look at verse 7. Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would have never known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, you must not covet. Friends, the point is, the law is not bad. We are bad. The law shows us our sin. Think about it like this. The law is an MRI machine. It scans you. What does an MRI machine do? It scans you to tell you what's wrong and broken inside of you. Does the MRI machine fix you? No. It gives guidance of where you're broken, but it doesn't fix you. Friends, the law is an MRI machine showing you what was already broken inside of you. Or, it's like this. Justin, my friend, will you turn off the lights? How many of you can see what this is? It's not a flashlight, it's a black light. What does a black light do? Reveals the filth that's there, but you can't see it with your normal eye. And I'm actually scared to point this around too much because I don't want anybody to freak out. But this points out the filth that's already here. Does this make sense? Is there anything wrong with the black light? And there's nothing wrong with the law. Thank you, Justin. Does this make sense to us? The law is not bad. We are bad. And perhaps you noticed in my story, I didn't say anything bad about Tim. In fact, what I said was Tim was an incredible, magnificent man. He was solid and dependable. Paul is saying there's nothing wrong with the law. There's something wrong with us. And then look at what he does. It's so interesting. He says, I would have not known what it is to covet. What? If you don't know, coveting is the last of the 10 Commandments. And the other 9 are visible. And this is what I mean by that. If I followed you around with a camera, I would be able to know if you kept the other 9. But coveting is internal. It's inside of you. And so think about this. Oh, this is so interesting. So this is what it means not to covet. Don't wish for something someone else has. Do not think you deserve something more than someone else. Do not compare yourself to others. Friends, our whole marketing industry is based upon the fact that we covet. And in order not to covet, you have to control your thoughts. And Paul's saying it's on the inside. It's always been about what's going on inside of here. The law has always been about your heart. So verse 8, but sin used this command to arouse, there's that word again, all kinds of covetous desires within me. If there was no law, sin would not have that power. All right, there's that word arouse again. Sin has set up a base camp upon the law to attack me. Sin made me look at the law and want me to do the very thing it forbade. And notice something so interesting. Paul is personifying sin. Look at it. He says sin would not have that power. Sin has power. Oh, that's interesting. I want to point out a couple of word pairs I want you to notice. The first one is law and command. You can see it right here at the very start, command. So general law, we talked about the law. The law is the entirety of the law of Moses, the 613. But then he talks about the specific commands. So he's saying coveting was a specific command. Do not covet, okay? Follow me. Then he talks about sin and transgression. He talks about sin and having the power of sin. He's personifying sin. But then he talks about transgressing and how he broke the specific command. There was a line in the sand and he crossed it. So he transgressed. And here's what's so interesting. He's talking about sin, the power of sin, having power over him. He's personifying sin. And Paul does this more than any other writer in the New Testament. But he wasn't the first to do it. And in fact, the first person we see personifying sin in the Bible is God himself. Genesis 4:7. You will be accepted. This is God talking to Cain. You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. But you must subdue it and be its master. And Cain can't control it. He can't control it. Cain goes on and kills Abel. So how relatable is this? The feeling of sin controlling you. You know exactly what that's like. You know exactly what it feels like to have sin control you. And this will lead Paul to say next week, Romans 7:17. So I'm not the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sin nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. That's the power of sin. So I bring this all up because Paul's point is the power of sin inside of you is stronger than the law inside of you. No one could keep the law. None of us could keep the law. But one did. That's the point. One person could keep the law. One person was perfect. All right, verse 9. At one time I lived without understanding the law, but when I learned the command not to covet, for instance, the power of sin came to life, and I died. So I discovered that the law's commands, which were supposed to bring life, brought spiritual death instead. Friends, I want you to catch this point. The law cannot prevent death, and it cannot produce life. The law cannot prevent death, and it cannot produce life. See, maybe you remember a couple weeks ago, we were in Romans 5, and there's a weird line that Paul says. He's talking about all the people who came before the law, how they all died. But notice, after the law is given, everyone still dies. Because the law cannot save us. The law cannot produce life. But one person could produce life. One person was able to keep the law. One person was able to save us. One person died and came back to life. Jesus. Verse 11. Sin took advantage of those commands and deceived me. It used the commands to kill me. But still the law itself is holy, and the commands are holy, right, and good. The law is good, and we are bad. Sin deceived me and used the commands to kill me. Friends, the enemy is a liar, and sin lies to you. You know, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of being able to talk to a spouse who's been unfaithful. And if you ask them, what led you down this path? You knew it was wrong. You knew it was wrong to cheat on your spouse. What led you down this path? Do you know what you usually hear back? For the thrill of it. I knew it was wrong, but I kept doing it for the thrill of it. Friends, the thrill eventually kills you. That's the point. Sin kills you. So this is our last verse, Romans 13. But how can that be? Did the law which is good cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. So we can see how terrible sin really is. It uses God's good commands for its own evil purposes. It sets up a base camp and attacks us. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how offended society gets? Or even you. Let's just focus on you. Not society, just focus on you. How offended you get from Scripture. And think about how offensive Scripture is. A couple of weeks ago, we read Paul, quoting David, say, "No one is good, not even one." Or what about Jesus, right? Everyone, oh, Jesus is so nice, he's so good. That's what secular people want to say. Jesus never offended anybody. What about when Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me? What about when Jesus tells the one guy whose fathers died, let the dead bury the dead? What about when the Bible says, this is what the Christian sex life looks like? What about when the Bible says, this is what Christians should do with their money? It's offensive. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but so many churches want to take the offensive stuff out. But if you do that, you take the truth out. And there's really nothing more offensive than that. See, our job as pastors and teachers is that not that we stand above this, and here's what I think, and I'm reading it into Scripture. Rather, Scripture's got to come first. Scripture's got to be first. So this is the journey Paul just took us on. We are no longer bound to the law, we are bound to Christ. And because of that, we follow and obey God, not because I have to, but because I get to. And this is what our thinking has to be. I am so sinful. I'm so broken. I'm not good. The power of sin is stronger than the power of the law in me. Yet, Jesus, you would call me to follow you? Wretched, miserable me. You would call me to follow you. Why? Because you love me? And it's from that place we obey God. This is what R.C. Sproul said. He said, this is why the secret of sanctification is to develop within our hearts a growing intensity of the desire to please God, to be obedient to Christ. This is why we are called to fill our minds with the Word of God, that we may know more of the loveliness of God, the majesty of God, the sweetness and excellence of Christ. The more we know him, the more we understand how excellent he is. And the more we begin to have the mind of Christ, the more we begin to approve the things that God approves and disapprove the things which he disapproves. Then our hearts will begin to come into line with our heads. Friends, we are no longer bound to the law. We are bound and unified to Christ. And because of that, our hearts are changing to long for the things of God. And Christ raises the bar. Because Christ says it's about your heart. It's about what's going on the inside. Think about this. There are many sins you can say you may not have committed, but how many sins did you want to? This is what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. And look at this. You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Friends, the law of Christ is harder than you thought. So I want to leave you with this idea. What areas in your life are you excusing your own sin because you can clear the lower bar, the Old Testament, but not the higher bar, the New Testament? Or in other words, where are you falling short of Christ's standard? So as we wrap up and we put a bow on this section, this is what we have to look at, where Paul's driving us to. He's driving us to this question. Who is it that was born under the law but not subject to the law? Who came and perfectly fulfilled the law? Who was it who conquered death and sin? And who was it who had no sin nature? Who was it who redeemed us? Jesus. Jesus. The only way we can have right standing with God is because of the sacrifice of Christ. The only reason we're no longer bound to the Old Testament law is because we are now bound to Christ. Or as one writer said, Jesus raises the bar and exposes all the ways we have never and can never measure up to the law, much less the heart behind the law. And he shows us that it was never about following laws, never about attaining some written standard of perfection, but about growing in our relationship of love with God and with others. So what are the sins you are clinging to that are preventing your growth? Let me pray for us. Lord, we love you and we praise you, and we thank you that you're such a wonderful God. And we ask that you would show us, what does it look like to live under the Spirit? What does it look like to live following Christ's law? And we ask that you would change us, Lord, and transform us. Whatever sins we are clinging to that are preventing our growth, that you would help us with that, Lord, and that you would free us from those sins so we could have a better relationship with you, that we can know more about who you are. Lord, we love you and praise you. In your name, amen.